We're on Lamed Aleph, Amid Aleph. Let me just clarify where we're holding in the Gemara so that we get our bearings. Yesterday we saw a Mishnah, very interesting, that talked about both Safek Kiddushin and Safek Gerushin. Guy, you're not sure whether you presented her this erva with proper Kiddushin, meaning an erva to the brother, right? Ruvain is married to a woman, he's got a brother Shimon. Then he marries another woman with a Safek Kiddushin. It's not clear whether it was a valid Kiddushin. And the example that the Mishnah had given is that he throws the ring, and it's not clear whether it landed closer to her or closer to him, and then the wind blows it away, so we don't know. And so the Mishnah had said that then Ruvain dies, and so it's a Safek whether this erva falls to Shimon for Yibum, and therefore the Tzara only gets Chalitza, she doesn't get Yibum. The other example that the Mishnah had given was an example of a Safek Get, where Reuven is definitely married to an erva to Shimon, and he's married to another wife. But before Reuven dies, he presents a Safek Get to the erva, and then he dies. Now the example that the Mishnah had given for a Safek Get is totally different from the example that was given for Safek Kiddushin. You would have expected it to say the exact same parallel, that he throws her a get and it's not clear whether it lands closer to her or closer to him. But that's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says he actually put it in her hands. It's very clear that he gave her a writ of divorce, but there's a question on the get. Either the date is not recorded, or the witnesses are not recorded and we're relying on his handwriting, or some other deficiency in the get. So the Gemara's question was, you see from here that, or its inference was that this is not a real case of a Safek get. This is where a get was definitely given, but there's some deficiency in the get. But in a real case of Safek, then we would say that we assume that she's still married. We assume because of this principle called chazaka, we assume that she's still married because that was her previous pre-existent status, and therefore we would say for sure that Tzara does not fall for Yibum and Chalitza, and she gets off scot-free. So the Gemara says, well, why not just give her Chalitza, just to cover all your bases? The Gemara says there's a downside to giving a Tzara's erva Chalitza. Because by giving her chalitza, you're also suggesting that she falls for yibum, and people might think that you could actually do yibum for her, and that could either in this case or some future case that a tzara erva may actually get yibum as a result, and therefore that would be catastrophic because that's mamash erva, and we don't want that to happen. So therefore we say rely on the chazaka. So therefore that's what we would say by a case of Safek Get. By the case of Safek Kiddushin, where we're not sure whether he presented the erva with Kiddushin or not, so there too there's a chazaka. There's a chazaka that the woman did not get the Kiddushin. There's a chazaka that the tzara does fall for Yibum. So there you're not losing anything by telling the tzara to get chalitza, because at the worst that'll happen is that people think she'll get Yibum. No, she'll get Yibum. Chazaka says that she's shayach to Yibum, that she's able to get Yibum. So therefore it's not so bad. So that's where we're up to at this point. That's the differentiation that we've made between a Safek Kiddushin and a Safek Gittin. So the Gemara now says, Eisvei Abai, and the word Gerushin is also synonymous with Gittin, okay? Just keep that in mind. So Eisvei Abai, Nafol Habayis Alave Albas Achiv, Ve'en Yadua Ezemehem Meis Rishon, Tzarasa Choletzes V'lo Misyavem. So we're going to see a Mishnah later on in the Maseches, which talks about where a man and his wife die simultaneously, but we're not sure which one of them died first. The house collapses on the two of them, Nebuch, and the problem is that the man's wife is also an erva to his surviving brother Shimon. So Reuven and his wife die in a collapsing house, and Reuven has a second wife. And the second wife is what we would call it Tzaras erva. So, but the question is that if the erva dies before Reuven, so then it turns out that at the time of Reuven's death, he was only married to a woman who's not an erva, and therefore she would be shayach to Yibum. But if Reuven died before his wife, and then his wife died shortly thereafter, so then it would turn out that the tzara does not fall for Yibum at all. So the halacha over there is the tzara gets chalitza, not yibum, because you don't know what her status is. So the Gemara says, Amai, hachanami nema, isha zu becheskas hetu l'shuk omedes, umisafek atabala osra, al ta'asrena misafek. And so the Gemara says, why don't there also should you not have the same concern? The concern should be, you know what, don't give her chalitza, let her go completely scot-free to the shuk, because by giving her chalitza, you're suggesting that you know with certainty that she falls for yibum, and the yavam might end up doing actual full-blown yibum with her. Why don't you have that concern? Here this woman has a chazak of being a tzaras erva. That's what she was all along. So place her on that chazak, under that assumption, and assume therefore that whatever status she always was in over the course of the marriage will be her status now, and you should not give her chalitza at all. The Gemara says, "V'chi teima hachanami l'chumra." Maybe you'll just tell me, well, the chalitza there is a chumra, just like we were suggesting before. But chumra da'asi lidei kulahu she'im ata omer choletzes misyabemes. But that's, like we said, that's a chumra that's going to lead to a kula, because by telling the yavam to give the tzara chalitza, people will think that we know definitively that the erva died before the husband, and therefore this woman falls to yibum, and people will think that she can go ahead and do full-blown yibum, and that would be catastrophic if indeed she still is a tzaras erva. So the Gemara therefore says, so you see from here that we can require a woman to get chalitza, even if there'll be a misperception that she's shayach to yibum. So why don't we say the same thing by a safek get? So the Gemara answers, Gerushin deshchichi gazru behu rabbanon, mapoles de lo shchichi lo gazru behu rabbanon. So the first answer is, we're only concerned about people having a misperception when we tell the yavam to do chalitza when it's a common situation. So what's a common situation? Divorce is quite common. And it's very understandable that if a man gives a safek gerushin to his erva wife, she's an erva to his brother, so there's very easy for people to have a misconception and to think that it's a bona fide divorce by virtue of the fact that the tzara needs to get chalitza, and people will therefore mistake it and say that she can do yibum as well. So to avoid that confusion, we let her off scot-free and rely on the chazaka. But a collapsing house which kills a man and his wife simultaneously or almost simultaneously is very uncommon. There the rabbis didn't feel that there was any harm in telling the yavam to do chalitza. There's more benefit than harm because it's such an uncommon situation that we don't have to worry about people getting a misperception. That's one answer. Inami gerishin de kayama erva de kamochach v'tzarasa kamasrachas la chalitza amri kamu bei rabbanon begita de gita ma'al yehuva asili yibume litzara. But, so the Gemara says, I'll give you another answer. There's a fundamental difference logistically between a case of safek gerushin and a safek whether the erva wife died before or after her husband. In the case of safek gerushin, the fact of the matter is that this woman is still standing. In other words, the husband gives a safek, Reuven gives a safek get to the woman who's an erva to Shimon. So we're right, she's right here. The fact that she's right here and the Chachamim say, give chalitza, Shimon, give chalitza to her tzara, people will think to themselves, the rabbis must have investigated the status of her get. They must have ascertained that the get really is a legitimate get. And therefore, the tzara, not only can you get chalitza, but you can get yibum as well. And that's where the misunderstanding is going to occur. But in a case over here where with a collapsing house, but mapoles, mikamu buhu rabbanon b'mapoles. But in a case of a house that collapses and kills both the man and his erva wife, how are people going to misperceive the situation and think that the rabbis ascertained that the woman died before her husband and therefore the tzarek definitely falls for yibum? Why would they ever think that? How could the rabbis ever verify which one died first in a case of a collapsing house? There's virtually no way to verify that unless you have excellent forensic instruments at your disposal, which Chazal don't have at this point. So, and even if, even today it would be difficult to verify which one died first. So therefore, no one's going to have the misunderstanding that the rabbis must have verified that there's no more, she wasn't his wife at the time of death. They're not going to be able to make that misconstrual. So now the Gemara says, okay, so we're working with your original assumption that in a situation of a safek gerushin, we say, do not give the tsaras erva chalitza because people will think that she's shayach also for yibum. But the Gemara says, v'gabi gerushin milotanan, but who...
We have a Mishnah that says do exactly that. Give the tzara chalitza in a case of safek gerushin. V'hatanan, look at the following Mishnah. Haisa omedes b'rishus harabim v'zarku la. If a woman is standing in the street and the husband throws the get at her, not a very polite thing to do, but he throws the get at her to divorce her. So karav la, that doesn't mean you still have to be a gentleman. So karav la migureshes, karav lo ain't a migureshes. So if the get lands closer to her, she's divorced. If it lands closer to him, within his daled amos, she's not divorced. But mechza al mechza migureshes ve'ena migureshes. But if it lands halfway in between, so then she is and she isn't, which means we're not really sure she's a safek. So ve'amrina lamayhil chasa, what are the ramifications of the fact that this is a safek? The kohen hu asurale, the erva hitzarasa baya chalitza. So the ramifications are two. Number one, that if the man divorcing her is a kohen, and then after he threw the get at her and it landed right in the middle, he has remorse and he wants to stay married to her, sorry, you're a kohen, you can't remarry your divorcee. That's one ramification. So even though it's a suffix, you can't remarry her. Ramification number two is that if this woman is an erva to Ruvain's brother Shimon, and then Ruvain dies, then you have to give chalitza to the tzara. So v'lo amrinan shima to omer choletzis misyabemes. And you see over here in that Mishnah that we don't have that same concern. If you give chalitza to the tzara, people will think that you can do yibum with her and the disaster will strike. That's not our concern over there. Why don't you say the same thing over there as we say over here, that you shouldn't give her chalitza because people will misconstrue the situation? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because ha'itmar Allah Rabbi v'Rav Yosef da amri to Ravaihu hacha b'shtei kitei edem askinan echos ameres karav lo v'echos ameres karav lo dahavale sveka de oraisa. He says, I'll tell you the difference. In that Mishnah over there where the guy throws the get and the wife in the street, he says that's a situation. You know why we have a safek? Because we have two discrete sets of edim. Two guys say that it landed closer to her, and the other two witnesses say it landed closer to him. Now, in that situation, when you have two full sets of witnesses, then the chazaka is not the overriding criterion. The overriding criterion is the biblically mandated set of witnesses who say that she is divorced. And by virtue of the fact that she is divorced, she's shaykh to chalitza or to yibum. We don't let her get yibum because there's another two that say that she's not divorced. And so therefore, we can't let you do yibum to the tzara. But at the same time, because we have two full witnesses who say that she is divorced, we tell you have to do chalitza over there. What about our Mishnah? Umasnisin dahacha bekas echas dahavale sveka derabanan. But over here, the suffix of if you were to throw it at her and it lands in the middle, we only have one set of witnesses. One witness said it was closer to her, the other witness says it's closer to him. In our situation over here, you don't have two full biblical set of witnesses who are saying that, testifying that she's divorced. And on that basis, the Gemara says, you do rely on the chazaka. The chazaka then becomes the overriding criterion, and therefore it's perfectly fine for us to say that she gets nothing.
Where possible, why don't we require him to do it again?
One second. It's a valid question, but let's say the guy's not here anymore.
Where possible.
Perhaps, yeah, of course. If any case of safek where it's possible, we want to do it again. But let's go on. So the Gemara now's question is, how do you know that our Mishnah over here is talking about where there's only one set of witnesses? One says that she is divorced, one says that she's not divorced. That you can make this differentiation between our Mishnah and that Mishnah, because the Gemara says, Dumyu de Kiddushin. Ma Kiddushin bekas echas, af gerushin bekas echas. Answers the Gemara, because our Mishnah lists one case after the other. The first case is a case of Kiddushin, a Safek Kiddushin, and the second case is a case of Safek Gerushin. So just like the case of Kiddushin is only where there's one set of witnesses, one witness says she's married, the other one says she's not married, so to the case of Gittin, one witness says she's divorced, the other says she's not divorced. The Gemara says, but the Kiddushin gufayo mimai de bekas echas, dilma bebeis kitei edim. But how do you know that the case of Kiddushin in our Mishnah is with only one set of witnesses? Where do you see that in our Mishnah? Maybe it's with two sets of witnesses. And so the Gemara explains, Iba beis kitei edim tisyabim ve'in bekach klum. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you. You know how I know that we're talking about only one set of witnesses? Because if there were two sets of witnesses here, then I would say very simply, look, there are two witnesses that are saying that the woman is not married, So therefore, let the tzara go ahead and do full-blown yibum. But the Gemara says, what are you talking about? But what about the fact that there are two other full-blown witnesses who are saying that the erva is married? How could you then tell me that when Ruvain dies, that tzara falls for full-blown yibum? That doesn't make any sense what you're suggesting. V'su b'shtei kitei edim nami sveika derabanan hi. De'amrinan uke trei labahadi trei v'isha ukma chazaka. And furthermore, your whole premise is wrong, says the Gemara. Your premise is that when you have 2 against 2, we say that the overriding criterion is the witnesses and not the chazaka. But that's not correct. Even when you have 2 witnesses against 2 witnesses, we say that the 2 sets of witnesses cancel each other out, and you resort back to the chazaka. So this differentiation, this distinction that you're making between whether you have 2 sets of witnesses or 1 set of witnesses to testify whether she's divorced or not is a falsity. It's not even true. And how can I prove that to you? Mida dahava anichsi de Barshatya, because there's a famous story about Barshatya, who was a man that shortly before he died sold his estate. The Barshatya Zavin Nichsi, he once goes ahead before he dies and sells his estate. Asu beitrei va'amri kishu cholim zavin, va'asu beitrei va'amri kishu shota zavin. One set of witnesses, two full-blown witnesses, say that Barshatya was of sound mind when he sold his estate before he died. And the other 2 witnesses say, what are you talking about? The man was totally senile. He was out of his mind when he sold his property. And therefore the sale is not a valid sale. So what are you supposed to do in that case? Va'amar Ravashi uki trei lahadi trei va'ara ukma becheskas Barshatya. Ravashi said, the 2 sets of witnesses cancel each other out, and all you're left with is a chazaka. What was the chazaka? The chazaka was that the estate is Barshatya's, and therefore it remains in the possession of Barshatya and his heirs. And so you see very clearly that even when it's 2 against 2, they cancel each other out, and you rely on chazaka. So we're back to our original question. Why we see that from our later Mishnah, that when there's a real safek get, whether it's closer to her or closer to him, we do tell the tzara to get chalitza. How can you tell me that our Mishnah does not subscribe to that? So the final answer, says the Gemara, is you're right. Ela Amar Abaya Yagid Olav Reo, Tana B'Kiddushin V'Uadin L'Gerishin, Tana B'Gerishin V'Uadin L'Kiddushin. So Abaya says, you know what? Our whole premise was wrong. Our assumption was the fact that the Mishnah gives an example of Safek Kiddushin as we're not sure whether the ring landed closer to her or closer to him. And we didn't give the same parallel example by a get, so we assumed that a real Safek get like that, you wouldn't get chalitz at all. But that's a wrong inference to make. The reality is, the pasuk is Yagid Olav Re'o, that a neighbor indicates about his other neighbor. In other words, you look at the neighbor and you can extrapolate to the other neighbor. What does that mean? What the Mishnah really meant to say is, here's a case of Safek Kiddushin, of whether when you throw it to her and you're not sure whether it was landed closer to her or closer to him. And that's the exact same example of a Safek by Gerushin. And you want to know about a Safek Gerushin? When you wrote a faulty get because there was something deficient in the get, and that's exactly applicable also to a Safek Kiddushin. If you present a woman with a shtar Kiddushin and it's faulty, then you also have the same kind of Safek. In other words, we're not differentiating between Gittin and Kiddushin. Both of them have the same halachic status. A Safek is a Safek, and in both cases the woman, the tzara, gets chalitza. So now the Gemara says, so Amalei Rava, Iyagid Alav Reo, my Zehu de Ketani. So Rava says, I have a big problem with what you just said, Abaya. Go back and look at the language of the Mishnah. After the Mishnah discusses what is Safek Kiddushin, it says, Zehu Safek B'Kiddushin. That's a case of Safek, Zehu Safek Kiddushin. That's a Safek Kiddushin, implying only this case is applicable to Kiddushin, but other cases of Safek are not applicable to Kiddushin. And then it says, you know what a Safek Gerushin is? And it tells you a faulty get. Zehu Safek Gerushin, implying that only this is a Safek, but other cases of Safek would not apply to Gittin. So according to you, Abaya, that's totally not true, because they're both applicable to each other. So Ela Omar Rava, Kol sheyesh bekiddushin, yesh begerushin, v'yesh bekiddushin, v'yesh begerushin, masha'ein bekiddushin. So Rava says, I agree with you, Abaya, partially. You just have to modify your statement somewhat. Really, the way you read the Mishnah is as follows. Whatever the Mishnah wrote is considered to be a case of Safek by Kiddushin, also applies to a case of Gittin. And therefore, just like by Kiddushin, if you're not sure whether it was closer to him or closer to her, that's a Safek. So too by Gerushin, if you're not sure whether it's closer to her or closer to him, that's also a Safek. But there's a certain situation by a get, which we consider it to be a deficient get, and by therefore it's a Safek, which is not considered to be deficient in the case of Kiddushin. V'zehu de gerushin lav davka. And therefore, when it says zehu, that only this is the case where there's a suffix is only by gerushin, that's not to be taken literally. Because the truth of the matter is that there are other cases of suffix that apply to gerushin, like if it's suffix karavlo, it's not sure, we're not sure where it landed. Elamishum detana zehu b'kiddushin tamanami zehu b'gerushin. But only for symmetry, since the Mishnah limits that only this case of Safek creates a real Safek Kiddushin, but not the case that we're going to discuss by Gerushin. That's why it said Zehu. This is the case of Safek by Kiddushin. So for symmetry, it also wrote it by Gerushin, but it's not to be taken literally. V'zehu di Kiddushin l'me'ute ma'isataka. Let's speak it out now, the Gemara says. So you're telling me that when the Mishnah says that this is the only kind of Safek Kiddushin that exists by Kiddushin, what is it coming to exclude that is a Safek by Gerushin but is not a Safek for Kiddushin? L'me'ute zman deleka b'Kiddushin. It's coming to tell me as follows. Remember we talked about a deficient get, a faulty get? One of the examples of a faulty get was everything is written great, but you leave off just one thing. You leave off the date. In that situation, the Mishnah calls that a faulty get, and therefore it's a partial severance, it's like a suffix, right? But by Kiddushin, if you leave off the date off of a shtar that you present a woman for Kiddushin, guess what? It's Kiddushin, 100%, not even a suffix, there's no deficiency whatsoever. That's what Rabbi says is what our Mishnah means to imply. So the Gemara says, well then why is there no symmetry? Why is it by a get you need to have a date written on it? And why by Kiddushin do you not need a date written on it? So the Gemara says, Let's think about this for a second. Why did the rabbis in the first place require you to put a date on a divorce document? So there's two different opinions that we're going to see. The first opinion is because it has legal ramifications as far as the husband's rights of the wife's estate. There's a halacha called nechsi milug, which we'll learn about later on, which basically states that once a man and a woman get married, fully married, living under the same roof, then the husband, the woman has to relinquish control of her holdings, of her real estate holdings to her husband. The husband becomes now the active controller of the real estate, even though her name is still on the title, and he can actually consume the produce or the dividends of that property for the duration of the marriage. Once they get divorced, the husband has to relinquish all control back to his ex-wife. Now, the reason for putting a date on the get is therefore for a very practical reason. Let's say the husband keeps consuming the dividends of the real estate well after he divorces her. She can take him to court and say, look, the date on the get says that from this and this date, my husband's been stealing assets from my property, and this is what he owes me. So there's a very legitimate reason why you'd have to put a date on a get. The reason why there's no reason to put a date on a Kiddushin document, if that's the whole reason, because of the financial ramifications. Because when do you give Kiddushin? You don't give it right before they live together. You give it at the time of Erusin. You give it at the time when they're just betrothed to each other. At that point, the husband has no control over his wife's assets anyway. Only at the time of Nisuin does the husband control his wife's assets. So it's irrelevant what date it was that they got betrothed. There's no financial ramification. So that would explain why you don't need a date written on Kiddushin. But that only explains it if that's the reason why the rabbis instituted putting a date on a get. But there's another reason that's discussed in Maseches Gittin. The other reason is Ela laman dorma mishum basachos liskin zman mishum diika liskin zman. But the other reason that's discussed in Maseches Kiddushin is why? Because of the case of basachosa. Now you have to sort of stretch this out. Let's unpack this. What does basachosa literally mean? My sister's daughter. What does that mean? It means that in a following situation, look, a man whose wife commits adultery, right? So he's so upset with her, he wants to throw the book at her, take her to Beis Din. If the Beis Din paskins that she committed adultery, stone her. What do I care? She betrayed me, right? But that's only true if she's not family. But family, if she's family, we don't kill family, right? We don't knock off the family, right? So she's my niece. She's my niece, but she's a terrible ne'er-do-well niece. She's a bum. So she went ahead and had an affair behind my back. But how can I willingly submit her for execution if it's my sister's daughter? She's family, right? So therefore, Chazal were concerned that what's going to happen is, if you don't put a date on a get, what this man could do in order to protect his niece from getting executed in Beis Din is that he hears that she committed adultery. He'll write her a get. No, he won't put a date on it at all. He won't put a date on it at all. Not backdate it, no date. He'll give her the get after the fact, and then when the Beis Din arrests her and takes her for judgment, she'll say, look, I was divorced, so what kind of time is I'm a single woman now. So the rabbis were concerned that there should be no shenanigans, that there should be no games played, and therefore they said, no, when the witnesses are present, you mark the date on the get, and that way we'll be able to protect the situation where a man who's divorcing his wife really just wants to do it to protect her from being executed.
An uncle's an uncle.
An uncle is an uncle. That's right.
It's more respect for the sister.
Well, okay.
Okay.
So the Gemara now says, if that's the reason, so then you have the same concern for Kiddushin. You should put a date on Kiddushin as well. Because why? Because let's say a man presents his niece with Kiddushin, and the following day she goes and has a fling with a guy. So she's liable for the death penalty now. But if there's no date on the get, the Kiddushin, someone will tell her, okay, fine, you'll get arrested, and they'll see the Kiddushin, and they'll say, okay, but it was after the fact. It wasn't before I had the fling, it was after the fact. So why don't you put a date on the Kiddushin as well to avoid those kinds of shenanigans? So the Gemara answers, Mishum de'ika demakadesh bekaspa v'ika demakadesh b'shtar lo token rabbanan zman. The answer is very simple. There's only one method of get, and that requires a date. But there are multiple methods for Kiddushin. Since many people are Mekadesh with Kesef, there's no date written on the ring that you give the wife when you Mekadesh her with Kesef. So therefore the rabbi said there was no requirement for a date on a shtar Kiddushin as well. So Amalei Ravacha Berei de Rav Yosef le Ravashi V'ha'avda di'ika dekani bekasba v'ika b'shtar v'token rabbanan zman. So but why should this be any different from the sale of slaves? When you sell a slave, if you sell him through a shtar, you have to put the date on the shtar. If you sell him through kesef, where there's no shtar, which is also a legitimate form of sale, there is no date, and yet the rabbis required a date on the shtar mechira for a slave. So why is there a requirement there, and there's no requirement for kiddushin? So the Gemara answers, Hasam ruba bishtara hacha ruba bekas. But the answer is very simple. In most times when there's a sale of a slave because you want documentation, most people sell with a shtar. But with kiddushin, most people are mekadesh with kesef. And therefore the rabbi said, since the vast majority of guys get a ring for their girlfriend instead of writing her a piece of paper, therefore we're not going to require you to put a date on the kiddushin. Iba yasema. And I'll give you another answer. You know why there's no requirement for a date to be written in Kiddushin, even though the same concern about these shenanigans with your niece still exists with Kiddushin as much as Gittin? Mishum de lo efsher. Because you're not resolving the issue. Because heichi liyavid. Because what are you supposed to do with the shtar Kiddushin? Lincha gabi dida. If the woman is in possession of the shtar Kiddushin and there's a date written on it, so machkalei. She'll just erase the date if she gets arrested by the Beis Din. And if the Beis Din wants to execute her, because they say, well, you were married when you had the fling, she'll just erase the date on the Kiddushin and she'll get off. Lincha gabi didei, if the man is in possession of the shtar Kiddushin, zimnin de basachoso hi umechape Allah. He'll also, if it's his niece, he'll want to protect her also. So he'll erase the date, or he'll say, I lost the shtar Kiddushin. Lincha gabi eidim, to leave it with the witnesses, that we also don't want to do. And you know why? Because I dechiri lesu lisod ve'ilo zimnin dechazu michtava va'asu masadi. We don't want that to happen either, because if the witnesses remember clearly what day it was, then let them testify without having the shtar. And if they don't remember, our fear is that they'll come to Beis Din and testify not on their memory, but based on what's written in the shtar. And even if I was a witness that signed on the shtar, I'm not allowed to testify based on what's written on the shtar. I have to testify based on my memory. And V'rachmana Omer mipiyam v'lo mipi ksavim. And the Torah says they can only testify based on their memory, not based on what their signatures are on. So therefore, it's also not proper to leave it with the witnesses either. So therefore, ihachi. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, that's why a date doesn't help for shtar kiddushin. Ihachi begerishin nami neimahachi. Why don't you say the same thing? If you give a woman a get that has a date on it, she can always just erase the date. So how are you resolving the possibility of there being shenanigans? So the Gemara says, Hasam lahatzala didaka asi, hacha lechova didaka asi. Answers the Gemara, because if a woman were to erase the date on her get, we would place her on a chazaka of being a married woman, and the Beis Din would execute her anyway. So there's no reason for a woman to erase the date, because the Beis Din says, well, if there's no date, we have to assume that your divorce took place after your adultery, and we're going to stone you to death. Whereas by kiddushin, if there's no date written on it, we assume that her chazaka status was as a single woman. So therefore, the rabbi said, look, let's put a date on the get. We don't have to worry that the woman's going to erase it, because then she'll only be getting herself in further trouble. But by kiddushin, if we put a date on it, it's not going to help anything, because she could always erase the date, and then we're not going to have any better knowledge than when she put the date on it to begin with. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Gimel Achim, we'll do this very quickly. Gimel Achim Nesuin, Gimel Nachrios, Umeis Echad Mehen. So you got three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, who are married to three women who are not sisters at all. We'll just call them A, B, and C. Abigail, Beatrice, and Cecilia. Okay? We'll call them whatever you want. Those are the first three names that came to my head for A, B, and C. What?
Slumbered, what is it?
Anyway, but A, B, and C. Okay, we'll just call them A, B, and C. They're not sisters at all. They're just nachrios, right? Reuven dies, va'asa bahasheni maimer, and Shimon, instead of doing full-blown yibum to A, gives A maimer, umes, and then Shimon dies. So she's got her partial zika is still with Reuven, because she's not fully yibumed by Shimon, and she's partially connected to Shimon. So the halacha therefore is harei elu cholzos v'lo misyabemos. So in this case, both Shimon's widow and the Reuven's widow that Shimon gave a mimer to both get chalitza, they don't get yibum. Why is it? Shenemar umeis achad mehen yavama yavo aleha. The Torah says that if one of the brothers dies, then the Yavam shall have Yibum with his widow. Misha aleha zikas Yavam echad velo she'aleha zikas beis Yavam. So what we learn from here is that only if a woman has zika from one dead man, then she's shaykh to Yibum. But if she has zika from two dead men, she has partial zika from Reuven and partial zika from Shimon, so she's not subject to Yibum at all, and therefore you give her chalitza. Now, Rabbi Shimon Omer miyabim le'ezer sheyirtze v'chol eitz lashaniya. So Rabbi Shimon disagrees. Rabbi Shimon says, you know what? No, you're not going to do that. You can do yibum to whichever one you want, either Shimon's widow or Reuven's widow, and then give chalitza to the second one. Now, what's the difference between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim? The Chachamim say that Maimer creates a partial marriage. Rabbi Shimon, if you recall, we learned before, holds that a Maimer is a suffix. What it does, it either is 100% a marriage or 0% a marriage. It's not that it's a partial, it's not that it's a 50% marriage, it's either 100% or 0%, and we're not sure what it does. So basically the way that Reb Shimon looks at it is, mimon afshach, no matter how you look at it, either this woman, A, is either 100% Reuven's widow, or she's 100% Shimon's widow. In either situation, she's yibumable. Okay, to Levi, who's the surviving brother, either as Reuven's widow or as Shimon's widow. Now, in the event that she's Reuven's widow, then you can do full-blown yibum to Reuven's widow to A, and Levi can also do full-blown yibum to B. But what if she's 100% Shimon's wife? then you can do full-blown yibum to A, but you don't get to do anything with B, because once you've done yibum to one tzara, you don't do anything to the other tzara. But since we're not sure whether she's fully Ruvain's widow or fully Shimon's widow, give yibum to one of them and give chalitza to the other one, and then you've covered all your bases. The Gemara now says, let's clarify. You just quoted a pasuk that according to the Chachamim, a mimer creates a partial marriage. Now, if a mimer creates a partial marriage, then I have a problem. You're telling me that it's based on a pasuk? The izika space Yevamim deoraisa chalitza nami lo tiboy. Well, then why does, in a case where there's a partial marriage, where there's partial zika from Reuven and partial zika from Shimon, you quoted me a pasuk that she's not shaykh to Yibum, then why give her chalitza? The Torah is basically precluding her from the whole parsha. So rather, the Gemara says, no, that's not. We're not saying that this is a work. This works deoraisa. The whole institution of maimer, according to the Chachamim, is only a rabbinic marriage. It's not a biblical marriage, a partial biblical marriage. So elamid rabbanon ugezera shema yamru beis Yevamos habos mi bayis echad misyabamos. Rather, a maimer midioraisa does absolutely nothing. Rabbinically, it creates a partial marriage. Why then do we say that she only gets chalitza and not yibum? Why is that? Because the Chachamim made a gezerah. They said, you know what? Our fear is that if we let you do yibum to one of them, people will come to say that, well, look, he gave her a mimer, so she's really part of Shimon's house, and people are going to say that two Yevamas who come from one house are subject to yibum. And so therefore we're not going to let you do yibum to either of them, you have to do chalitza to both. But the Gemara says, but that's too drastic. Uniyabim lechada v'nichlos lechada. Why don't you just do yibum to one and chalitza to the other? Because even if it's only a rabbinic marriage, at least you can do yibum to one of these women, give yibum to one, and then give chalitza to the other one. So the Gemara says, Gzeira shema yomru bayis echad mikzasu banu mikzasu chalutz. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because if people perceive this woman to be married to Shimon, and then Shimon dies, and Shimon leaves over two women, and we're going to tell you that you can do yibum to one and chalitza to the other, so people are going to think, hey, anytime a man leaves over two wives, you can do yibum to the first one, and you can do chalitza to the second one. And that's not true. Once you do yibum to the one, the other one gets off scot-free. So the Gemara says, v'yomru. What's so bad about that? What's so terrible? That if a guy gives an extra chalitza that's meaningless, what damage was done? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you what. If the Yavam Levi he does yibum first and then does chalitza to the tzara, you're right, no damage was done. But elagzera dilma chalitz bereisha v'hadar miyabe. But our concern is, what would happen if Levi does chalitza first to one of them and then chooses to do yibum? That's going to create a disaster, because once you did chalitza to one woman, if the two women are from the same household, you can't do anything to the other woman. She's an eishasach. The kamlei ba'asher lo yivna, Rachman Amar kivin shalabana shuv lo yivna. Once you've done chalitza to one, you're done. The house is no longer accessible to you at all, and the Torah says you can't build it up at all anymore. So, and if you do, you're pogeya be'erva. You're marrying an erva. So therefore, that's our concern. If we were to allow you to do yibum to one and chalitza to the other, people would reverse the order and do chalitza first and then do yibum, and that would be a disaster. Amar Rava. So finally, we finish with this. Rava says, "Nasan get lema'amaro hutra tsarasa, aval hi asura demichlafa bebalas get." Rava says as follows. Let's go back to the case. Ruvain dies, and Shimon gives a mimer. Now, we said that if at that point Shimon dies, both women have to get chalitza. A and B have to get chalitza. But let's talk about the following case. Let's say before Shimon dies, after he gave the mimer, he also gave a get afterwards. In that case, he's fixed the problem that the mimer created in the first place, and therefore if Shimon dies, Levi can do yibum with B, because she's the only woman that's married to Shimon at that moment. But he's not allowed to do yibum with A. You know why? Because people can get confused, and they'll think that in a case of a standard case where there are two brothers, Reuven divorces his wife and then dies, people will think that you can, even though this woman was divorced before the guy died, you can still do yibum with her. So therefore, in this case where Shimon gave her a mimer and then gave her a get, we completely preclude her from yibum, and you only give her chalitza. So Ika da Amri Amarava Nasan get Lamamaro Hutra Afilu Hi. My time and my David Ba Shakle. And others learned that Rava was even more permissive. If Shimon gave a mimer to A, and then he gave a get to A afterwards, she completely reverts back to being purely Ruvain's widow. And then when Shimon dies, Levi can do Yibum to both women. He can do Yibum to Ruvain's widow, and he can do Yibum to Shimon's widow. Why? Because everything all the damage that Ruvain caused is completely undone through the get. And so you have two different versions of what the final halacha is, but the bottom line is that a get resolves the damage that a mimer caused. And we'll hold it here for today. You all have a wonderful day.